Okay, so let's bring on our panel, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about transforming how we travel, delivering Ireland's sustainable mobility policy. Would you please welcome to the stage from the OECD, Mariana Mirabile, Professor Peter Jones, the Professor of Transport and Sustainable Development at UCL, Stephen Murnane, Youth Assembly on Climate, and Elaine Howley from SAGE Advocacy. Huge round of applause, please, for our panel. Steps are just over this side here. Out of the way. Now, lovely to see you all. Make yourselves comfortable. Folks, it's great to have you here. What I'm going to begin by asking is if you could just maybe give a 20-second potted version of why you would be on the panel, and I'm going to begin, if I can, with you, Elaine. Tell us a bit about yourself.
I have many years of advocating for the rights of people with disabilities. I started that out as a student. I have a particular interest in public transport because I have impaired vision and I entirely depend on public transport. I sit on the Disability Stakeholders Group and represent that group in the Department of Transport's Accessibility Committee, and that's probably the reason I'm here.
Excellent. But that's a wonderful perspective you're going to bring. Marianne, you might tell us a little bit about your role, please.
Sure. Many thanks. Hi, my name is Mariana. I work with the OECD at the Environment Directorate, and I work with many of you. It's great to see so many familiar faces on the OECD report we published last year. So we have worked with many of you in the past thinking about how we could transition towards sustainable transport systems.
Okay, so that's the international perspective, which you are going to add to as well. Peter Jones, you might tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, hello. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm based in the Centre for Transport Studies at UCL. My background is really on transport policy and travel behaviour, and I've worked a lot on running European projects, trying to understand across Europe what the issues are and how to achieve policy objectives.
And very finally, down the end, last but not least, Stephen, tell us a little bit about why you're with us today.
Yeah, I try to bring the youth perspective in transport. Any good business will tell you that if you want to be successful, you have to invest in the future. And young people are going to grow up in the transport systems and mobility systems we put in place now. So I'm going to try and bring the youth idea on how they could affect us.
Yes, and because ultimately you're going to be in charge eventually, and we're trying not to make a mess of it. That's probably what's happening. Okay, I want to begin by talking about what good looks like, because we know, and it's really good that Pete threw up those two examples, because obviously that's what good looks like, but getting to that can be a challenge. Mariana, from an international perspective, in your mind, what is good when it comes to sustainable mobility?
Sure. Maybe let me first say that it's a key question that we sometimes skip. So with in our work, envisioning the results a well-functioning systems get is really a first step for us. Together with many of you here in the room and internationally, we tend to define sustainable transport systems as those that where people can walk, cycle, or use public transport for the bulk of their trips. As the minister and as Pete as well was saying, these are systems where making healthy and sustainable choices is easier than taking, for example, private motorized modes. So that by design, they facilitate the use of these modes.
Yeah, so in other words, we use them. They're there and they are used. Stephen, from your perspective, what would good look like? Because younger people will tend to use public transport more than those. Running a car, owning a car, getting insurance, all very expensive. So younger people will migrate towards public transport anyway. So what would good look like compared to what we have now?
Well, in terms of what we have now, lowering the rates for young people, especially with the introduction of the young person and young adult leap card, that's already a really good start. I think, though, to get to good, you need to make it feel safer, and that's especially, like was mentioned earlier, in feeling safe in cycling. Is there anyone here, there's a lot of us from Dublin, does anyone cycle in Dublin city centre?
Okay, a lot of converts there already. I'm going to ask, can I ask the next question, or do you want to do it? How many of you feel safe? Sometimes, occasionally, kind of a half-hearted hands. So that's your point proven.
Yeah, so you can take it yourselves there from that immediate data. Young people don't feel safe cycling into city centre. I have an older brother. He originally cycled to work before he got a car, and now he won't cycle anymore because he knows that the car feels safer. Good will look like young people on bikes in the city centre, not afraid to cycle.
Okay, and that's a fantastic perspective to bring, particularly for two wheels. Peter, you've obviously studied this. There's global examples. Mariana gave us a little insight of what she thinks good looks like. What do you think good would look like?
I think good is having a set of land use patterns, transport systems, digital connectivity that enables people to access the goods and services, health, education, training, social networks they want to do on a daily basis. And sometimes that will involve doing things online, like internet banking and shopping. Sometimes it will involve using the 15-minute neighbourhood, being able to walk and cycle locally to access shops, healthcare, etc. Other times it will require longer journeys using public transport and sometimes cars, but in an environment where people feel safe and the environment is attractive and healthy.
Okay, and I suppose from your perspective, Elaine, good looks slightly different, doesn't it? Because good means safety is a huge important part of it. Access is even more important.
Yeah, I don't think good looks hugely different. I think it's very similar, but it's very particular because a lot of people with disabilities entirely rely on public transport, so they don't have another option. So it needs to be available, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be dependable, that you can rely on it, but it needs to include the whole journey from the time that you are making your booking to your destination, to all your travel to the train or the bus, from the train or the bus. And I think it really needs to include the perspectives of those people from the planning stages.
The challenge in public transport, and people in this room are acutely aware of it, is that, you know, we do need to bring about change. That's the Minister's point. It's going to take time. And bringing people with you is vital. My experience working in the communication side will be engineers are very linear thinkers. Here's where we are, that's where we're going, and we're going no matter what. And communications can become particularly challenging when you have opposing views, when people don't understand the rationale. And Mariana, that is key. You need to bring people with you to bring that change, because if you don't, empty vessels make a lot of noise and everyone starts going, well, maybe they are right. So how do we bring people with us as we bring about change?
Yeah. Well, a lot to say there. Maybe building on the previous presentation, I could say allowing for experimentation of what good looks like. We have just seen that when it's planned, there is more resistance to it. So allowing people to experiment, communicating about the benefits of the change. Of course, enabling the conditions so that the sustainable modes we could like most people to take are more attractive, that it is not an effort for people, but really they have a better commute by using these modes. So infrastructure and design is certainly key there. And yeah, I go back again to the communication part of things, because sometimes the way the perceptions can be misleading, and the way these changes are sometimes perceived are as anti-car changes, right? Yeah. But they are really pro-well-being changes, in the sense that it's about providing more access to most people. So communicating around the benefits and what it entails is fairly key to make people.
Peter, going back to the thing, COVID, it's amazing how quickly we moved across the water where you live, here in Ireland. We got things done a lot faster. We got cycle lanes put in. We pedestrianised streets. We made sure that, you know, we were going to invest in public transport and improve things where we could, because, you know, people needed to get around. I'm afraid we're losing that momentum. So how do you bring people with you and keep that momentum?
I think there are two things. First of all, as you say, engineers tend to think about a product or a project, building a road, putting a bus lane, whatever. Whereas for most people, it's not primarily the thing that's being put in, it's the reason it's being put in. You know, will it make my journey safer? Will it make it quicker? Will it make it healthier, whatever? And therefore, I think we need to be explaining more and discussing with people what the purpose of doing things are and what the benefits might well be. And I think also it's very important to hear different points of view. Increasingly, of course, with relying on online social media and so on, people tend to hear the views from people like them. And it's important to have fora where people hear different views and understand different perspectives, the need of people with disabilities and things like that. And also, where possible, to do co-creation. European project we finished recently, we were working with a number of cities around Europe about redesigning busy shopping streets with lots of conflicts and things, but working with the public, inviting people to discuss the needs of buses, pedestrians, cyclists, shopkeepers, etc., and working together, it was often possible, or generally possible, to reach agreement and compromise by understanding different views and working in an environment of sharing and trying to reach a common goal.
The simple thing, Stephen, for younger people would be say, price, make it free, make it cheaper. Yeah, that's going to do a certain amount, but what else needs to be done to convince your generation that this generation, I'm being very general with that sweep, some of you are quite young, I promise, that this generation has your best interests at heart?
Well, like what the National Youth Assembly was already established for, it's more about making decisions with young people rather than for young people. So, to give you the best example, if I was 15 and my mum and I were walking down the street and we had to turn left and right, and I wasn't really paying attention, she told me go left, I'd probably turn right, because it's someone older than me, I can't relate to them.
I have a 15-year-old, I know exactly what you're talking about.
If my mum had asked me what way I want to go, I would have gone left. So, like, I'm sure, like it was mentioned earlier, there's always science there. If you look into it, if you just talk to a young person, ask them, what's your point of view on this? You will always get, oh, well, I think this, or it might be a bit slow to it first, and say, actually, I'd like to do it this way instead. When those views are actually considered, you can even see from the National Youth Assembly, young people take part more, because we feel like we're not just being spoken for, we're being spoken with. But yeah, if you want to bring young people along with you, you have to try and engage with them, like was mentioned with the public consultation.
Elaine, one of the things that I've accrued over the years working in radio is that people who are living with a disability tend to have to constantly fight for everything. It's not that it's an afterthought, but it's that there was no thought a lot of the time into how this would impact somebody who may need to use a wheelchair, who may have other mobility issues, who may have visibility issues like yours. So how do you bring the people with disabilities with you at every stage in the journey?
Well, I don't think any person in this room intends ever to make another person's life more difficult. But actually, some of you need to, as Stephen said, engage with people from the planning stage, embed that in the process. It concerns me. There were measures rushed in during COVID. A lot of them were positive, but they're not positive when they undermine the rights that other people have to access the environment freely and to get around independently. There are lots of disabled people and older people. Our population is getting older. There's a lot of people who are now afraid to go out and use our footpaths because the line down the centre that says it's now also a cycle path, the shared space thing doesn't work. There are people who really can't get around safely. I personally have never felt as threatened in my life as I have in the last 3 years.
Why
ever.
so? Because people are not allowing that others might not have the same level of vision?
The footpath used to be a safe place. Now, where footpaths are shared spaces, they're no longer safe. But it also seems to have given people a license to use the footpath for everything else. So even in places where it's supposed to still be the footpath, there are electric scooters flying all over the place. There are cyclists going through lights left, right and centre. And the attitude is, I'm on a bike, I can do what I like. There's an aggression out there that wasn't there. And unfortunately, I'm all in favour of what the Minister is trying to do. I know that change needs to happen, but it cannot impede negatively on the rights of some members of society to get out and about and live their daily lives. That's the only thing. So spaces need to be separate. Cyclists need to be separate from pedestrians. And I'm really tired of hearing cycling and walking, because cycling and walking are so separate
Yeah.
and need to be separated.
Look, I walk out of my office where the studio is in Cork, and they put in a double cycle lane, and it's fantastic and it's great, and I've used it. But my brain still doesn't process that that's a cycle lane because it's new, and
No.
I've been nearly knocked down on more than one occasion, and I have full vision. So therefore,
But to create bus stops where it requires crossing over a cycle lane
Yeah.
to get on or off a bus, in my mind, is absolutely not acceptable.
But if you were brought in at an earlier point, or someone like you was brought in at an earlier point, they'd show that
I-
mightn't be thought of.
I cannot believe that we have developed a situation where we have bus stops where somebody will be killed getting off a bus onto a cycle track.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are
Well,
warnings out there that are not being listened
That
to.
brings me to my next point, and I'll stay with you if I can for this one, Elaine. What do we need to do then? What's our future focus? What do the people who are here, the councillors and the planners and the NTA and the department, what do we need to do to get to where we need to get to?
Oh, it's a big one. We need to include people. We need to look at the whole prioritisation of how public space is used. I think the most vulnerable in society need a safe place. So we need to look at the design manual for urban streets, roads and streets, and there needs to be a clear prioritisation. There needs to be legislation. It needs to be an offence to be on a footpath, on a scooter, creating danger for other people. So we have guidelines, we have standards, but it kind of doesn't matter if they're not implemented. They're not legislation. I personally think we need legislation. I think minimum standards, we shouldn't be aiming for minimum standards, we should be aiming for better than that.
Well, best in class is what we should be going for.
Absolutely.
And Mariana, that brings us to you on that. You know, that town that Pete threw on the screen, we want to live there, right? But we have to get there. So what do we need to do to future-proof the towns and cities? It's not going to be perfect everywhere, but we're going to have good examples. So how do we get to those?
Yeah, a big question indeed. I could say, going back to your previous one, a shared and common vision of what good looks like, bringing in diverse perspectives, bringing in the needs from different people. I could say as well, be ready to question ingrained ideas. So be ready to be uncomfortable with our own expertise. The systems, the transport systems that we have today, their design are the results of policies. And that is great news because it means that policies can change those systems. But if we go about changing those systems with the same ideas that built the previous, our car-dependent systems, same idea, same system. So questioning.
Well, if you do that, you've baked in the problem, haven't you? You're stuck in the middle. In many ways, we're trying to do the hardest thing in the world, which is to unbake a cake. All the ingredients are already mixed up, but we're trying to unbake that cake, aren't we? And we're not going to do that without creative thinking. Yeah. Peter, to you on that one. How do we get to where we need to be?
Well, first of all, what Mariana said around having a vision, and I think your National Sustainable Mobility Policy document is very good at setting out a vision and a pathway. I think that's a very impressive document. You then need in place funding, you need appropriate legislation, including enforcement, and you need the right administrative structures. And I think in Ireland you're really pulling those things together very well. And then I think other more local things are giving people the opportunity to experience schemes in other places, particularly local councillors and people that have already been introduced. You can see what they're actually like on the ground and talk to people who've been through that process to hear their concerns, and now it's come in, as you say, they feel much more happy about it. Giving people confidence that you can get somewhere at the end. I think that's really quite crucial.
It is a scourge in this country, and I say this as someone who speaks in the media. We will spend, I refer to it as the Joe Duffy paradox. The Joe Duffy paradox means that we talk about the issue, we talk about the impact, and we should talk about the solution. But Joe Duffy gets stuck here, which is why Liveline becomes incredibly frustrating, because we always get stuck in the impact. We never deal with the solutions. And where there's good examples, we should be shouting about them more, shouldn't we?
Yeah. And I think also we should recognise there are different points of view. And sometimes there's a tendency, if some people are opposed to something, to try and bury it or ignore it. But almost invariably it then bubbles up even more strongly.
Yeah.
To respect that there are different points of view and listen to them. And sometimes there are easy misunderstandings. So quite often shopkeepers are concerned that if you reduce parking spaces, they will lose custom and money. Whereas the evidence is that's not true. But the reason is that on a per visit basis, the car driver spends more than a pedestrian or a cyclist. but they go there much less often. So on a weekly or monthly basis, you get much more spend in your shop from a pedestrian, cyclist or public transport user than a car user. But if you remember, pre-COVID, the car user used to come in with a €50 note.
Yeah.
So quite often there are misperceptions. If you really listen and understand, you can explain it and reassure people.
Absolutely. I have two brothers who have shopkeepers, and they love the small transactions. Small transactions are their friend because there's a lot more of them. Stephen, for you, what do you want to hear? What do you want to be confident about that future and where we need to get to? What would make it solid for you?
I think a really good way of looking at it is look at where we are right now with that loan and its electric bus service. They had a plan, they communicated the plan, and then they executed the plan. Taking action on what we talk about and communicating effectively what we want to do from what we've talked about is how you convince a young person, okay, yeah, I can get behind that. Because I'm from Swords in Dublin, and there's no electric buses there. And then if you told me, like, oh, we want to get electric buses in, I'd be like, yeah, that's grand, but we want to get rid of carbon. We like a lot of things. But then you say, no, we've done it in Athlone, and we can bring that here. I'd be like, oh, well, there's something now. I think you call them Pathfinder programs, yeah? Mm. Highlighting them to young people is how you prove we're not just saying this to we call it greenwashing at the National Youth Assembly. It's how you make something look like it's going to be sustainable when it's not. You will get young people behind you if you can say, well, here's the proof, here's how you convince us that we can do electric buses and that it's a plan and here's how much they spend. You will always get a young person, not always, but you will get a lot more young people to support you if you can say, we had plans, but this is the result of the plan. It wasn't just something that fizzled out and they waited for their term to end and then they pottered off and so be them, it's not their problem anymore. It's no, the politicians in power actually brought results. It wasn't just talk.
It's funny, Pete described himself as a nerd earlier on. He's not alone. I saw a hydrogen-fueled test bus, and I genuinely got excited. And that's very sad, but I did go, look at that, look at the future. Haven't seen it since. It was a test one, I think, Anne. I think it was doing a tour to see how well it would last. But, that's the kind of thing that we will see that will make it different. I want to talk about road space allocation because I think this is the rock on which a lot of good ideas perish, because we are taking a model whereby everybody had a car and the car was supreme, and we're saying, no, we want to pedestrianise part of this. We want to put bikes into that. We want to prioritise slow movement, bring the speed limit down to 20, cue uproar, cue Johnny saying no one's going to come to my butcher shop anymore, you're going to put me out of business. I mean, I haven't done that into the shop in the last 40 years, but this is going to kill me. How do we prioritise, Mariana, to make sure that the people who are going to use that street, the people whose children are going to use that street, are going to benefit from the best type of layout?
I mean, the best type of layout, of course, depends on the context, right? There is not one size fits all, that's for sure. And Peter is doing a lot of work on that side with the MORE project on different street designs, very, very interesting. I got to go back to the vision. I got to go back to what is the shared purpose and how can the system design help us achieve that shared purpose. And that builds on our understanding of how the current design does not, and what are the steps to move into a design that is more conducive for us to get in better, more active shops, for us to get in better health, better safety, fairer access to services, etc.
Peter, the challenge, of course, is that we live in a country that was not exactly designed with modern transport in mind. Streets designed for horse and cart. Very few massive open thoroughfares, and if you have one, it probably bottles into a tiny little bit at the top. So we're not dealing with one size fits all. So that's where complication arises. What do you do when you don't have the space to allocate? Who should win?
That's a really good question, and it's a perennial question. I think the point is, first of all, to think about what do you want that street to provide. And we've done work in the UK and around the world looking at the role of streets in cities, both in terms of movement by different modes, but also as places, as destinations where people live or where they go to shop. And there's a balance, like your shopkeeper example. So there's a balance between the street for through movement and the street as a destination. And then you have to think about, well, space is limited. what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to maximize, for example, in some situations, efficiency of movement? In which case, then, if the space or capacity is limited, we might well be prioritizing public transport and cycling as having a greater capacity and throughput than cars. In other situations, we might be saying, look, this is our historic town centre, we want to really revitalise it and so on, in which case we want to widen the footways, limit the amount of curbside space, but reserve it for blue badge holders and reserve it for loading and things like that. In terms of actually the trade-offs, I mean, there are two ways in which you can try and be a bit clever. One is that you can try and share space, not pedestrians and cycles on a footway, but certainly in the UK, bus lanes also are open to taxis and cyclists, for example, but also by time of day. So again, a bus lane may be a bus lane in the peak, but off-peak it can be used for essential parking and loading. So we can either share space in some situations or allocate space differently at different times of the day or different days of the week.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be one size across the entire time. Stephen, I'm going to make a terrible version of a quote. Henry Ford was asked, if somebody at the turn of the last century asked, well, what would you like to get you from A to B? They would have said a faster horse. They wouldn't have said, I'd like a car. Unfortunately, Ford won and we all got cars. I'd imagine if you ask a lot of young people, what do you want the streetscape to look like? They're going to want access for public transport, they're going to want pedestrian access, they don't have cars, so cars are irrelevant to them, and they want to use that space in a safe way. Am I right or am I wrong? But does that doesn't solve the problem with the car though, does it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. You are right in a sense that, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of young people and even some of yourselves, like we've seen there, don't feel safe cycling in a high traffic area with a lot of cars. And then you have to consider as well, anyone below the age of 18, so that's 17 downwards, if they want to get into the city centre and they're not getting dropped by mum, dad or guardian, has to take public transport. It's the only mode they actually can't use because you can't drive. So we would advocate a lot for, well, we need the buses to be reliable, we need the buses to arrive on time, we need to get off somewhere where we're not going to be at risk. So if you're going to city centre and you're getting off at Irish Life, that tends to be very good. But yeah, like you were saying, if you want young people to get behind it, we definitely need it to be safe and reliable. But yeah, so you wouldn't really get a lot of young people saying, well, I want more parking spaces and I want less pathways. To bring it back to roadside allocation, there is a very good example here of when we were yesterday visiting some of the sites, some of you might have been there for, there was a new pedestrian-only bridge being constructed, and it led by a hotel, and one of the hotel owners was one of the biggest in opposition to that bridge being built because they said, oh, it's going to cause traffic and there's going to be loads of noise outside my hotel and it's not great. Halfway through the bridge being constructed, they realised, hang on, there's going to be loads of noise outside my hotel from people who are coming to my hotel, and now all of a sudden they realised it's going to generate business for them. And what I'm trying to tell you there is we can find ways that these things work for us. So while some people might not see the benefit in, oh, well, if there's less cars, there's less business in the city centre, you might realise, well, there's maybe 2 people in the car not coming, but there's the 40 young people on the bus coming into the city centre who are there now instead of the car, which could even help your business.
Yeah, and that's, again, communication. That's about bringing people with you, which we were talking about earlier. I have to say, you've given me great ideas, Elaine, for my next time I'm on a talk show, going, let's get those stupid scooters off the road. Put them back onto the road. They should be motorised. I think we've done it already. But the point is, when it comes to road allocation, priority has to be given to the most vulnerable user, who is the pedestrian, right? But then do we shove the cyclist back onto the road where he's competing with cars, or where it's a hard one to ask, particularly from an accessibility point of view.
Well, I think cyclists relative to vehicles are just as vulnerable as pedestrians are to cyclists. So I think there's a need to separate them out. I mean, if we're talking creative thinking, we need to think separate spaces, separate cycle ways, separate walking ways, not having anybody feeling unsafe, really. I think we also need to understand each other's perspectives a bit better, because what happens is something is brought in, and I heard Peter saying, bring something in and then get people's perspectives on it, and there's less bias. But if it's brought in without any engagement, then people who really are impacted by it need it to change. So I think access and safety cannot be compromised. And if something is brought in, like it was during COVID, as an interim temporary measure, then there needs to be engagement with the people that are impacted by it. What's happening is temporary measures are now becoming permanent measures, and there's no consultation, and there's consultation that sometimes just ticks a box, which is not it's not good enough when it comes to people's safety. So if we could work effectively together from the start and understand people's perspectives and have the user at the centre. Like time and time again, I've been on committees and not talk shows, but meetings, and I've heard, well, that's not the Department of Transport, that's the Department of Environment, or that's the local authority. We need to throw it all up in the air and say, okay, how in this area can we get this to work together?
User design, it's kind of key. Peter, you want to come in there briefly?
Up on that point, I think we do need to think more creatively about how we use our space. So, for example, when you have the cycle lane next to the curb, you've got the issue there of interaction with loading and parking vehicles, you've got buses pulling over, and when you have the cycle lane going behind the bus stop, the floating bus stop, you've got the danger for people, particularly with disabilities. Maybe in some situations, the cycle lane should go on the other side of the traffic lane. Then you won't have the interaction with pedestrians going to the bus stop, you won't have people pulling in across the cyclists. Done very rarely, but potentially that might be a solution in some particular situations.
But more importantly, if something isn't right, admit the mistake. Don't just leave it there and move on to the next project, which I think is sometimes what we do in this country. Ladies, we'll do it again, absolutely. But we have the right people in the room now to make sure it doesn't happen again. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please show our appreciation for Mariana Mirabile, Professor Peter Jones, Stephen Murnane, and Elaine Howley, ladies and gentlemen. We leave you go off the stage this side, folks. Thank you very much indeed.